Hey, welcome to How It Works. This is Bob Ambrogi, and today we are getting a press briefing from about the Stretto Research Suite, a fairly new product introduced from the company Stretto. And we're going to talk a little bit about the background of it and get into a demo of it in just a few moments. But let me just start with introducing our guest today. First of all, I'm joined by Randall Reese, Managing Director. Randall, how are you?
Good. How are you, Bob? Thanks for having us.
Good. And also Robert Klamser, Chief Innovation Officer. Robert, how are you today?
Good morning, Bob. I'm great. Thanks again for having us.
Good. Well, before we kind of get into the product that you've recently launched, I wonder if you can kind of just give us a little bit of a background on the company itself, on Stretto, and what your focus is, what you do.
Sure. I can kick that off. And really, to give the background of Stretto, it makes sense to go back maybe even 20 years, 25 years in the bankruptcy space, because that's where a lot of the people, and including myself and Randy, started our connections. The co-CEOs of Stretto, Eric Kurtzman and Jonathan Carson, actually co-founded a bankruptcy claims and noticing agent in 2000. It was called KCC. And really, the whole goal back then was to bring technology to bankruptcy lawyers and to create more efficiency in the Chapter 11 process. I was lucky enough to be one of the first employees, depending on who you ask, maybe the third, maybe the second. But that's how I got my start. The company grew to over 300 employees and it was sold to a publicly traded company out of Australia. And it was actually back while working at KCC that many of the leadership team that's now at Stretto met with Randy, who was an attorney at the law firm Skadden, was working on a very meaningful case to us at KCC called Delphi. And Randy made a very strong impression, both because he was intelligent, but he was also approachable and able to work with a variety of different audiences. And there's something to be said about taking a complex subject like the law and making it understandable and digestible to others. So Randy was just someone that you stayed in contact with, that you remembered. Fast forward, the KCC company is sold, the leadership team breaks up, goes to different places. I co-founded another bankruptcy firm called Upshot Services that was, again, really focused on being technology forward. We were the first claims agent in the country to use electronic claims, electronic ballots in bankruptcy cases, and we kept in touch with Randy. While this was happening, Randy had built a company that he'll talk about probably called Chapter 11 Dockets. And it was this research platform that he designed really for himself as an attorney. And we connected with Randy and we started working with Randy and his platform. He was working with us and connecting us to folks in his network. And really, there was just this mutual respect for his way of doing business, our way of doing business. While that was all happening, the former founders of KCC were connected with Stone Point Capital, and they got back into the bankruptcy industry with the goal of creating a bigger, more comprehensive platform that provides services and technology for bankruptcy professionals. So they launched a company, they made their first acquisition in 2017, and then formally launched Stretto in 2019. At that point, they bought the company that I founded, Upshot, and then 2 years later, 3 years later, Randy can correct me if I'm wrong. No, because it was actually more like 5 years later, bought Chapter 11 Dockets. And in the meantime, we've been acquiring different software platforms, service companies, professional service companies that serve the bankruptcy community, whether it's financial advisors, attorneys, work with the courts. And we've been assembling all these, trying to take the best of breed from the different service lines from the different companies and put them together into a company called Stretto. And hopefully we can provide a solution to fiduciaries, bankruptcy professionals, legal professionals at any part of a bankruptcy case. And so right now, what that means is we have three primary service lines. We serve bankruptcy trust, Chapter 7 bankruptcy trustees. We have a software platform that manages their cases, manages their relationship with their bank accounts, with the courts, with their calendars. We have a software platform called Best Case by Stretto, which is used by 70% of all bankruptcies filed in the United States to complete all of the forms and manage the forms and information involved in their cases. And then we have our Stretto Corporate Restructuring Services, which we serve as the claims and noticing agent in about a third of the largest bankruptcy cases filed in the United States. We like to say anywhere between 70 and 80% of all the bankruptcies filed in the United States somehow flow through our ecosystem. And that's really what taught us. Being involved in that entire ecosystem is really what taught us about this specific need that we wanted to address with what is now Research Suite by Stretto. And I think that might be a good time for Randy to introduce himself and tell us a little bit more about the origin story of Chapter 11 Dockets, which is now Research Suite.
Sure. Thrown off a little bit by such a kind introduction. So, as Robert said, I started my career as a restructuring attorney at Skadden. Kind of, I graduated law school in 2001. So I've been doing this obviously for a long time, but also, kind of at the beginning of electronic case filing in federal courts and really sort of seeing things move from paper to electronic. And as part of that process, you know, the way that we would do things at Skadden and the way that other large law firms would do things in restructuring cases, there were some inefficiencies in it in terms of how we would access information. There was really important information in that lived in PACER, but was really difficult to access. And I'm sure for your audience, I don't need to go into all of the difficulties of interacting with PACER.
Yeah.
Sure, everyone is more than familiar with that. Restructuring is really unique in a lot of ways in that there's a tremendous amount of filings that are generated in a case and generated in a relatively short order. Saks Fifth Avenue filed for bankruptcy earlier this year, and there are already almost 2,500 items on the court docket.
Wow. So it's
So
not like a litigation docket. It's a much more.
restructuring is really sort of a hybrid of litigation and transactional work. So from a transactional perspective, what's interesting is that it all happens in public. Everything is being publicly disclosed, being discussed at hearings that, the transcripts are publicly available. But from a litigation perspective, the litigation that happens in restructuring tends to happen on a much more expedited time frame, right? Because you've got a company that the parlance in bankruptcy, which is maybe a little bit overstated, but the idea of the melting ice cube, right? You've got this company and the value is degrading as it sits in bankruptcy. So you've got to move fast in order to preserve that value, both for creditors, but also for all the other stakeholders, right? You've got employees, you've got customers, you've got vendors who are all reliant on this company. So there was all this information in PACER that had a lot of value. We used it all the time, but it was really inefficient to get to. And there were a lot of difficulties around knowing what existed and then being able to find it. And so, sort of had that, there's got to be a better way to do this moment, and set down that path of trying to figure out that better way, and really specific to the restructuring practice, because it is unique in the way that both it generates information in PACER, the value of that information, if it can be extracted and made available in a meaningful way. And so spent a lot of time doing that and built up a customer base. And then, as Robert said, we sort of kept in touch, and as Stretto was building and sort of thinking about what this current era of legal and technology and the intersection of those things and how it was changing, as we had those discussions, I think we came to a view that there was a lot of commonality in how we viewed the way that those things would play out, particularly in our practice area, and that we would be better doing it together than doing it separately.
Fascinating. So when you started developing this Chapter 11 dockets, were you still practicing then, or did you leave practice and go off into the tech world?
So I was in the midst of the Delphi Automotive case, which at that point in time was the largest auto industry bankruptcy in history. It was the former parts division of General Motors had been spun out of General Motors and saddled with a bunch of pension liabilities, depending on whose purview you have as to whether or not that was fair or unfair. But nonetheless, obviously that was a very time-consuming case to be involved with. And so, I had always had an interest in doing something entrepreneurial. I just turned 30. Wasn't married, didn't have kids yet. And so, it was an optimal time to maybe explore other avenues, let's say.
Randy undersells himself, and he didn't just have an idea and decide, okay, I'll go build it. And he wasn't building it while he was practicing law, but when he made the decision to, like, when this became real, and I think a lot of people understand that moment. You can have a great idea. Everyone has ideas, other ways of doing things. And what he did was go to Berkeley, get his MBA, surround himself with intelligent tech minds, intelligent minds, and build the company that way, and then launched it to the restructuring space and built it really then over 17 years. I mean, this is not some technology that he built a few years ago and Stretto acquired. He has longstanding relationships with firms, and it's because he did it right. He is an expert in this domain. So he will undersell it. He fully committed to what he was doing and doing it the right way.
Yeah, I didn't feel like he was underselling himself. I mean, just having just having been a scat and handling some of these major restructurings tells me something about the guy, I think. So what you've recently announced builds on that product, right? And then extends it with further capabilities. I mean, tell me about how you took what you acquired and built this into something new.
I can kind of start this part of it just because I can tell you part of the reason, like I said, the appeal with Randy was one, we've known and trusted Randy. We know he was an expert. And we used Chapter 11 dockets because part of what he did was simplify a process that was very complicated. It was very easy when you say, there's one case and I know the document I want. You could just go to PACER and search for that one case and that one document. But that's not the way research happens. And what Randy addressed was oftentimes you're saying, I need to do research on cases in the aviation industry. Well, those happen across multiple dockets. Multiple jurisdictions. So right there, you're going into different PACER you have to drill right into the different PACER jurisdictions and then create different searches from there. So one search to find precedent on one issue might take you into 10 different jurisdictions, logging in 10 different times with 10 different sets of credentials, navigating slightly different ways of searching for those 10 cases. And so Randy made it easy to say, I'm looking in this industry. This is the type of document I'm looking for. And here are the different fields and this is the different types of filters I want to use for the documents I'm looking for. And it was excellent at that. And then you had AI happen. And we realized not only when people are doing the research, the first step is finding the documents. The next step is reading and understanding the documents. And so when we created Research Suite, the goal was to handle more than just the first step. Was to be able to say, okay, now you have your 10 documents that you're looking for. How can we make it so that you can understand those documents faster? You can get the insights you need from the documents faster and hopefully produce better quality work faster and hopefully cut out a lot of the unnecessary reading of unneeded information to get to the insights you're looking for. So that was what we saw. We saw a platform that worked and we saw technology that was developing and thought, if we have all these resources from the different companies that we've acquired and the professionals that we have, what if we could help add that in to what was already an excellent platform?
Yeah. Randy, do you want to expand on that at all in terms of?
I mean, I think Robert covered a lot of it. What I was going to say is, sort of what we built in our starting point is that we've really sort of carefully curated a collection of data, which now, is roughly, call it 4,200 large Chapter 11 cases filed kind of since the beginning of electronic filing. And across those cases, we've got over 5.5 million, close to 6 million docket entries now of data. So we've got this really large corpus of information that we're building on top of that is large, but also curated, right? So we're really focused on what are the cases where the information lives that's really going to be most important to a practitioner, right? What are the cases where there are really meaningful things happening, but aren't going to rise to the level of a reported opinion, right? So those transactional things that you don't necessarily get a bankruptcy court judge issuing an opinion saying, yes, I'm going to approve this asset sale, but that might be 100 pleadings, multiple versions of the asset purchase agreement, and a 6-hour hearing before the court where investment bankers from Lazard or Rothschild get up and talk about the process that they use to sell these assets and why this generated the maximum value for these assets. And so building on top of that corpus, which is both large but also curated, I think we recognize as we incorporate AI into that, provides a really powerful basis upon which we can do all the things that Robert talked about really building into those workflows of what would somebody do with that data once they take it out of our system? But also, how do we help that, you know, you may have 40 airlines that have filed for bankruptcy and they've all filed some version of a particular document. How do we synthesize that amount of information in a way that is efficient and effective, right? Because realistically, your associate may not be able to sit and read 40 versions of the same motion, but using AI, we can do that first pass to say, of these 40, here are the five that have the provision that you're really interested in, or here are the similarities and differences across those. And so if we can help you synthesize that information in a more efficient way, our view is your ultimate output for your client is going to be better.
I think you just answered the question that had been percolating in my mind, which is this is much more than just a PACER Docket Research Tool. What I had been wondering when I first heard about this is, there are other products on the market that are help you search PACER more easily and more efficiently. But what you're describing with the curated data, with the AI layer over it, with the analysis and synthesis, really takes us far beyond just that, right?
That's right. And we've also, sort of pre-AI, we've always been adding additional metadata that's really very bankruptcy and very practice specific around all of the cases, but all of the docket entries. So addressing that situation of you've got 10,000 docket entries in a case. How do I find the three that are relevant to me, right? Or whatever that number is, or I've got all of these cases. How do I find the cases that are most relevant to me? So that metadata is sort of the first layer, and then we can obviously layer AI on top of that to make it even more powerful.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that I think there was two areas where we did more than just layering a Pacer search on top of Pacer. It's also on the AI side, because you might be wondering, why couldn't you just dump the 10 documents we're thinking about in these aviation cases into Claude and ask Claude to do the same thing that Research Suite would do? And what's important is that, one, the way we've designed the summaries that we build, the views that we provide to attorneys, are specific for the restructuring audience, and it factors in the importance and the significance of the hierarchy of the bankruptcy code, local rules, and a docket. You have to understand, pulling text from a version one of an asset sale agreement that has been modified multiple times. It's important to know that, yes, this statement was made in version one, but it was not made in version four. And our system was designed to understand the distinction between the relationship of kind of the timeline of the evolution of a motion or a series of docket entries, versus you just drop documents into a mainstream LLM, and it will find the right text. It will find relationships with the text, but it doesn't necessarily understand those relationships in the context of bankruptcy law. And so we really make sure to do that. And it's important to know that every time in all of our AI generated products, and so that's different types of summaries, different types of comparisons with documents, everything is cited back to the document. And so, one, it's never generative. We're not generating drafts of documents for you. We're helping you understand the documents that you decide to research, and everything in those summaries that are being created cites back to the underlying documents you select. So it's important to know that it's not just a wrapper on top of Pacer, and it's also not just ChatGPT on top of documents.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure we leave time for a demo. Is this a good time to jump into that, or is there anything else kind of
Absolutely.
that you want to? Yeah. Okay. Good.
Go ahead and
Let's
share
do
my
that.
screen here, and we can look at Research Suite itself.
Randy and I can talk and tell stories a lot. I mean, like I said, we've known each other for 20 something years. So I'm glad you are keeping us on track with the demo.
Absolutely.
I like stories. It's
Um,
okay.
all right. So this is the home screen that a user gets to once they log in. And we'll kind of go through. There's sort of three key ways that a user can use Research Suite currently, and we'll kind of go through all of those in process. This homepage sort of is the keeper of your current session, and so this is sort of recognizing that, frequently our users are getting pulled away, whether it's, for a meeting or a phone call. And so allowing them to be able to come back in and say, oh yeah, this was the search I was working on. I didn't quite finish what I was doing. Let me jump back into that. Or, I downloaded a document or I looked at a document, but I forgot to save it to my system. Let me go back and get it. And so, this kind of keeps them updated. You've also got the full history of anything you've ever done in our system. But looking at kind of how does a user use our system in their day-to-day practice? And we've got kind of three ways to use it. One is searching in a single case, searching across multiple cases, and then the really AI powered item that we'll talk about, our newest feature, which is our precedent package and AI dossier feature. But the single case search is really around that topic of, there's a case, I know the case, I know what I'm looking for, or I know that I want to find something in that specific case. Let me just, rather than going to PACER, rather than going to another service, let me do it in a really efficient way. And so what we offer the user is the ability to search by case name or case number, obviously, and with a predictive text feature. So, as I start typing, it recognizes what are the cases that match that text string. And then we talked about metadata earlier. This You have document options where a user can then filter that docket either here or at any point in the process. And let me run the search and we'll kind of show you how those document options work. So as I jump in, this is reminiscent of a PACER docket. You've got, your basic case information around, supplemented with things like the industry, et cetera, at the top. And then you've got the docket sheet. And as we mentioned, these cases can generate a lot of volume here. FTX, famous crypto bankruptcy, almost 36,000 docket entries. So you can imagine just doing sort of control F is going to be a challenge, or, finding a particular document in this docket sheet. So this is where, that metadata that we've been layering on comes into play. And kind of the key things that I'll note is we tag everything with a type category, which includes, familiar things like an application or a complaint or a motion, but also bankruptcy specific items like a disclosure statement or a plan, a petition, a notice of claim transfer. These are things that are sort of, bankruptcy specific events. And then we
How does
also,
that tagging happen?
so we add, kind of over 1,000 docket entries per day on the average business day. So we've gotten pretty efficient at doing that. And what we do is we have kind of a multi-step approach where we have an automated system to do the first level of predictive tagging, and then we do a human review on top of that to ensure accuracy, because this is really powering a lot of what we do, right, in terms of the functionality and making this efficient. So, it's very important to me that we have a high level of accuracy. So we do layer on that human layer of review on top of our automated process.
This goes back to what we saw, and I think in our role and in Randy's role, where there are certain practitioners that practice in their local jurisdiction, and they're familiar with the nuances of the way PACER operates in their local jurisdiction. But as we started working across jurisdictions, across cases, across industries, realized how much variance there is in how people tag their documents. Because right now, what goes into PACER, most of the tagging is based on the user. That's thousands and thousands of paralegals from firms or first-year associates who are learning a process, all the way up to partners. And their style, they might if they're filing a motion to approve a plan and the plan is attached, maybe they just tag it as a motion and not plan. And if you're looking for a plan of reorganization for a case, that's a very important document. And if you just go into PACER and you search for plan, unless you're doing your control F, you might not find that. And so this is where we realize that, like I said, we have to do this right, because the whole premise of the platform is this has to bring up search results the way you would have intended as as a practitioner. This is essentially what Randy wanted as a practitioner. And so the tagging was critical. The other thing worth noting is that these are not just the PACER tags. We've expanded the types of, like Randy said, showed a few examples, but across the board, we were always trying to expand to give more functionality than what people are getting just by using PACER.
Yeah. So, Robert mentions the plan being sort of a key document in a case. So if I want to find, out of these 36,000 almost docket entries, which ones were the plan? If I add that document type, you can see FTX filed 9 versions of their plan in the case. And so, that's really where this tagging comes in, is being able to say very efficiently, I know FTX filed a plan. I'm just looking for FTX's plan. It's still much more efficient to be able to do that and get from, out of the 36,000 docket entries, which ones were the plan, and also knowing that there are 9 versions, and not just picking the first version and saying, okay, that must be it. But realizing, what was the total scope of that. I'll note just quickly that we source all of our documents from PACER. So when a user downloads that document through our system, they are getting the same document that they would get if they went directly into PACER. We source everything from PACER to ensure that we're matching both the content but also the format of what they would get if they went through PACER.
Are you
So
archiving documents as users download them from PACER?
we are, yeah. So as users download, we are building an archive as well. And then we've got, as Robert mentioned, we've got our other business lines that also draw in a lot of data. So we're able to generate some efficiencies around, combining the data where it's relevant. Some of our businesses are very Chapter 7 focused. That's very different than where we're really focused here on the Chapter 11 side. But we do have, commonality across some of the documents that come in on the Chapter 11 side with our claims and noticing business.
And it's important to note that we archive all the documents that come in. Well, if a user is part of a firm and a firm has an enterprise firm account, not everyone at the firm has access to all of the documents that have been downloaded by the users. And in fact, at our enterprise level, anyone has access to all of the documents that have ever been archived by the platform. So if you download something you forget that you did, you don't have to repurchase it. You're not reacquiring it. Once you or your firm accesses a document, though, that's part of your repository of information in perpetuity.
So that sort of address that efficiency of just, hey, there's a case, there's a document. Let me find it in an efficient way. Our multiple case searches is really addressing that question of, hey, what are the most relevant cases that I should be searching in for precedent, but maybe I don't even know that those companies filed for bankruptcy, right? Because it's not a case that I personally was involved in. It's not a case that maybe my firm was involved in. Multiple case search is really addressing that question of, I don't know what I don't know, but I know that I'm involved in an airline case, and I want to go find the airline cases that are most relevant. And so here, we've built out identifying for all of those over 4,000 cases in our database, what are these key data points that a user would want to be able to search our system on? So, we've got, for example, industry categories. So if I am doing an airline, I'm representing an airline, I can go down. We've got broad categories and then subcategories. So, I can say it's air transportation is the industry. I can then adjust based upon the size of the case. And I'll just pause here to note our coverage. As I noticed, as I said previously, we curate. Our curation standard is For $100 million in assets or larger, we cover all of those cases. So if a company files and identifies as having $100 million in assets, either in their petition or in their SEC filings, to the extent that they're a publicly traded company, we will cover all of those cases. So that we are comprehensive above that limit. But then we also look at all of the other cases that get filed, because the reality of bankruptcy practice is that $100 million and up cases mostly get filed in a relatively small handful of jurisdictions. Those cases are filed in Delaware. They're filed in the Southern District of Texas. They're filed in the Southern District of New York, maybe a couple others. But there's a lot of jurisdictions which never see $100 million cases. And so what we want to ensure is that for any jurisdiction, we have whatever the most meaningful cases are in those jurisdictions. And so rather than applying just a hard limit, we then look separately at, if I'm looking at the bankruptcy court in Montana, what are the most meaningful cases that have been filed in Montana, even if it's not $100 million and up. And so we look at what are the cases that we need to cover to be able to say that if you come into our system and you're involved in a case in any of the federal jurisdictions, we're going to be able to provide you with the most meaningful precedent.
Is meaningful always a dollar calculation, or are there other
It's
issues that
not.
can come up in
No.
a case?
Yeah. And so there's a couple different ways that we will look at it. We'll look at who are the parties involved. What's the scope of the operations of the company? Is it because there are companies that maybe, let's say, asset light, but have a large number of employees, a lot of revenue, et cetera. So maybe a very meaningful company, but not particularly large in terms of assets. And then we also look at from a broader restructuring perspective, is this an industry that is meaningful to restructuring practitioners? And the example that I always use is there was a point in time where a lot of ethanol plants filed for bankruptcy. And at that point in time, it seemed like it cost $75 to $80 million to build an ethanol facility because they were all right around that size. But there was a lot of restructuring activity in that industry. And so we certainly look at that and say, this is something that our client base is likely to be involved in. And we want to make sure that when they come into our system, that we have that information available to them.
Do your customers request coverage?
They do. We'll get situations where, they'll reach out to us and say, hey, we have a relatively, maybe a relatively small client, but we're representing them in this case in a far-flung jurisdiction. And we'd really like to be able to access all those documents through your system. And certainly in that situation, we're always looking for the way to say yes, right? I mean, and the reality is that if it's meaningful to one of our clients, it's probably meaningful to more than one of our clients. And we recognize that.
This is one of the benefits and the beauty of having a founder who was a practitioner, because Randy understands and has always understood what makes an interesting case. And so there are times that there are cases that don't meet the asset threshold, that might not even meet an obvious threshold that we've stated to the market that, hey, we'll always cover a case with 100 million in assets. But there are cases that Randy just knew were notable. And so we would add those, we would add those into coverage, because there's no rule that says, well, this is going to be really interesting, this is going to hit the Wall Street Journal, but it doesn't meet our criteria, so we're not going to include it. If Randy felt that it was of note, we would include it, because like he said, if it's interesting to him as a practitioner, it's likely interesting to at least one other firm, if not many.
So jumping back into the multiple case search, we've got sort of the common things, but I'll just also note that we have, again, the restructuring focus here. So a category like prepackaged and pre-negotiated bankruptcies, which may not mean a lot to folks outside of the industry, but is very meaningful to restructuring folks, because this greatly affects the way that the case proceeds through. A prepackaged case is a case where you've gone out, you've gotten support of your meaningful creditors, you've solicited their votes. And so those cases can go from start to finish in a number of weeks or even less, as opposed to a free fall bankruptcy, which may sit in bankruptcy for years, and that affects the precedent of what happens, because frequently those are cases where creditors are getting paid 100 cents on the dollar, and so there's a lot of flexibility for what happens, and a lot less contention around what happens when everybody's getting paid. All of your general unsecured creditors are getting paid in full, and you've got to deal with your secured creditors to take a haircut. But that's where our restructuring focus really lets us be very, very specific in some of the things that we're doing around searching and filtering. So, if I run a search here, I said airlines, $100 million and up in assets, and you can see we've got 45 of those cases in our database, and a user could then, adjust those filters if they wanted to, or they can start looking at, across these cases, I've got hundreds of documents, but if I know what I'm looking for here, I can apply those filters here as well. And again, we've got sort of the multi-level, either broad categories or much more narrow categories. So down to, there's a section of the bankruptcy code, section 1110, which deals specifically with aircraft leases. If I wanted to just find documents related to that, I can choose that very specific topical category. I'll note here, without scrolling through them all, we have 82 topical categories that we tag everything into, which again are all bankruptcy specific. But if I'm just looking for documents related to section 1110, I can run that and see the number of documents have updated, and to how many documents just cover that. And I can select the cases that are of interest, and then get to a list of just the documents which match my filters in the cases that I've selected. So, I've got a lot from American Airlines. If I, wanted to say, I just want to see orders on that topic, I can adjust my filter again. It's sort of constantly updating, but the user can get down to, from a very broad category, I could have selected all 40 of the cases and gotten to just those documents that are of interest. And so again, this sort of ends with that point of, let me download the documents or get summaries of individual documents. But our last feature that I wanted to touch on is really where we really layer in that next step of looking at how we implement AI effectively here to allow users to gain that efficiency around extracting information from these larger
Randy,
pages. Yes,
will you go back to the search results? Are they?
I can.
So I wanted to make a note. So scroll down so you can see it starts with American Airlines SDNY case, and then
Mhm.
keep going, because Aloha is, scroll down to where you start seeing Aloha Airlines.
Well, let's see. So Aloha was much earlier. These are organized by date. So here you can see these are
Okay,
some of
so
the
it's,
Aloha results.
what's important just to know is, as you were looking at the the tagging and the filtering and the results, it may look familiar because it looks like a PACER screen. Here's my list of
Mhm.
documents. But sometimes it's some of the simplicity in the features where you see the most power, which is all of the filtering and the fine tuning of the results that Randy was just doing. Those are where he ended up, was two different cases in two different jurisdictions. And it's the same kind, but the search results and the functionality and what he's doing is very uniform. And this is what we were talking about early on. When you're looking at precedent, oftentimes you're not necessarily looking for precedent in one jurisdiction. You need different types of cases, different types of documents. The simplicity and the value of that can't be overstated, is that he was running searches, running filters in very different cases, very different jurisdictions, and yet the results are very elegantly presented, very easy to follow. And it's very simple. I mean, he ended up with just two cases, but initially he started with 10. That could have been 10 different searches just to get that list of 10 cases. So that was a long side note for a very simple feature that is powerful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Robert, I'm actually kind of glad you jumped us back here just because I'll note if you look at the third entry here, docket number 392 from Aloha, you'll know we sort of talked about we're searching for documents relating to aircraft leases, which is section 1110 of the bankruptcy code. I'll just note docket number 392, opposition to debtor's motion filed by creditor International Lease Finance Corporation, related document, motion to approve. Nowhere in that docket entry does it have the term aircraft. It does have the term lease, although in the name of the creditor, and it doesn't have section 1110. So this is where, our tagging is capturing what is the topical category here, what kind of document is this, to make it searchable in a way that had you open this in Pacer or had you open this in a system that didn't have that bankruptcy specific tagging, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to find this entry just by searching for aircraft documents, something that mentions aircraft, something that mentions airplane, something that mentions a section 1110. So that's where this tagging really uncovers what is the substance of documents, even where, as Robert noted, maybe a first year associate entered in Pacer opposition to debtor's emergency motion without explaining what exactly that motion is.
What I want to know is, do you check this every time you're headed to the airport for the latest filings and make sure your plane's going to take off that day?
Well, so my first case start to finish was US Airways, and at that point in time, we talked about that, sort of going back to that melting ice cube argument. The argument was nobody will buy a plane ticket 3 months out on a bankrupt airline because they don't know if it's going to be there when their flight comes. And we sort of felt like enough airlines had gone through bankruptcy that people were getting more comfortable with it. But maybe with the Spirit situation, maybe that
Yeah,
has become more true today than it was
that's what I was thinking about.
last
All the
year.
people who showed up not knowing.
Yeah, all the people who showed up at the airport and the yellow banana planes were all gone. So, as I said, our most recent feature really builds upon that multiple case search, but layers on AI. And so this is around the idea that let's get to that collection of documents as a user that are most relevant to you. And then let's get that first level of analysis to allow you to take, this system will let you choose up to 100 docket entries, and it will then run through and create an output that we call the AI dossier, a multi-layered summarization and analysis piece that we think of as the first draft of what an associate might provide to a partner internally of, hey, I did this research. Here's the output of that research. And again, as Robert said, our goal is not for it to be the final draft of the output. Our goal is for really adding efficiency to that first draft process. So again, here, we're looking at what kinds of documents are you searching for first, and you can use those filters again. So it might be that I'm looking for, motions and orders, and on the topic, let me go down and kind of emphasize again the bankruptcy specific nature of it. There's a whole category of bankruptcy practice, which is around the idea of first state pleading. So that's, as a company, we filed for bankruptcy. What do we need to do to be able to keep operating in the ordinary course as we go through this case? And so they deal with things like cash management. They deal with their employees, taxes, and then, vendor relief. So, what vendors do we need to pay to make sure that we can still turn the lights on in the morning, right? So if I choose those and I move on, I've now got those case search criteria again. So I could, again, maybe look at airlines, $100 million and up in assets, and maybe I add, a date filter to say, let me look at kind of the last 5 years, right? So if I say, 2020 to today. Okay. So I'm at 15 cases, 29 documents. If I feel good about that, I can go forward. I can also adjust my filters if I wanted to. And so then now here I see the list of cases that match my case criteria. And then I can expand these to see the documents which match. So again, these are motions and orders on the topic of first day vendor relief. And as a user, I can choose all of these documents, or I can go through and sort of, pick and choose, maybe utilities, maybe not that interesting to me. But as I go through and choose what are the documents that are of interest, I'm building that package of precedent, right? So, um, and again, I can choose up to 100. So, Azul, which was a Brazilian airline, maybe all of those are interesting to me. Oh, here's the previous Spirit case from 2024. Maybe all those are interesting to me. And I can kind of go through and select a handful of cases. And again, so here I've got, 6 cases, 42 documents or docket entries, excuse me. And then I can go through and the system will then look and make sure that all of those documents are available either in our system or in PACER. So, if something had been sealed or something where it wasn't available, that process would identify that, hey, that document's not available. And then it's going to get to a confirmation screen where it's saying, here are the documents you selected. Here's kind of the size of the documents. Here's the cases. And the user can go through and say, yes, that matches my expectations, or no, it doesn't. And then once they purchase, it's
Pricing, is that the PACER download pricing, or is that's your pricing? Or
that's our internal pricing. So our pricing depends upon what, we have a variety of obviously subscription tiers and, sort of bespoke enterprise pricing for some of our larger clients. And so, all of those elements would depend, but generally our precedent package is priced primarily on a per page processing fee because we are ingesting all of this information and then doing a, a multi-level summarization and analysis on top of it. I'll go into and switch screens to kind of look at what that output looks like in terms of what a user gets access to. But this is now running asynchronously in the background, and the user will get a message to their email when it's ready. And once they get to that,
It's important to note that with the precedent package, this is not a product that just downloads. This is not a way to just get the documents. And maybe that's an important distinction. When Randy was doing the single case search and the multi-case search, if you just wanted documents, you would be doing the searches and you would be identifying documents to acquire. We probably didn't clarify that when you're building a precedent package, it's not just about grabbing a bunch of documents. This we are processing, the system is reading and analyzing the documents as well. So that's why the pricing looks a little bit different. If you were just acquiring the documents, you just pay a price per image, or it then depends on your tier. But the precedent package is doing a lot more than that, which will become obvious when Randy gets to that next step.
yeah. So what we're looking at now is what a user has access to once that precedent package finishes running. And so here in this situation, these are 77 court filings across 9 cases. And this is really the multi-layer piece of it. So at a base layer, the user's got access to all of the documents that were sources for this precedent package. So these are the actual court filings from PACER that the user chose in that process to say, these are the things I want included in my precedent package, and they can, download any of these. Again, those are match the PACER output. And then our system runs through a multi-step process to make sure that we're extracting information and summarizing accurately. It first runs through an individual document summarization. So it's creating a summary of every individual document in that collection that they created. It's also, to the extent that there are multiple PDFs associated with a docket entry, it's creating a summary of each one of those PDFs individually to understand the content of just that individual document. Then,
And where
yeah,
that's relevant is oftentimes the documents are a motion with the proposed order attached. So you can get a summary of the motion and then a summary of the proposed order so that you can quickly determine, the summaries can be helpful because oftentimes the documents are 100 plus pages. And then two, you can understand the distinction between what the motion is asking for, what are the terms of the proposed orders, if there's additional exhibits attached that are attached as separate documents on PACER, you get a summary of all of those so you can quickly identify where do you need to drill into, where's the substance that you need to read and pay attention to.
Yeah. And so our next level of summarization is, to the extent that there are multiple PDFs associated with a single docket entry, we then create a summary of all of those documents in context of collectively. So what is that docket entry in total? So in Robert's example of, there's a motion with exhibits, one of which is a proposed order, by then combining that summary to understand the relationship between those documents, we're helping the system understands that actually this is a proposed order that was attached to a motion and not a final order that was entered by the court. So it understands that relationship. We then go to a case level summary. So if I've chosen multiple documents from a case, it then generates a summary of that collection of documents on a case level to understand the context of those documents combined together. So in the Avianca case, of these 8 documents that I selected, how do those documents relate to one another? Or, in the FTX example that we talked about earlier, if I had chosen those 9 versions of the plan, how did those relate to one another, right? Like temporally, that this is the earliest filed, and sequentially how they grew upon or changed between versions. And then the capstone piece is the comprehensive AI dossier, where it's taking all of that information, again, up to 100 docket entries, could be thousands of pages of documents, and generating a combined comprehensive and also comparative analysis of the collection of documents. And that's what ultimately is that first draft of that associate motion, if you will. And what that looks like is this. This is an AI dossier looking at airline industry precedent on first day vendor relief. So the thing that we sort of started jumping into, and you can see it starts with an executive summary. It's telling you the cases that it analyzed, giving you some themes across those. So, committee oversight, payment caps, dip financing, reclamation. These are all very bankruptcy specific things. And then it goes into a detailed analysis. So, it identifies that they used a common legal framework and that they all cited to Section 363B of the Bankruptcy Code. It's also noting that they cited the same cases across these documents, the same cases as the same case opinions. Again, cited in all 9 cases, whereas integrated resources was cited in, it looks like 6 of the cases. It's identifying where they cited the same cases versus where they cited different cases. Then looks at, they cite the doctrine of necessity, looking at their exposure here, where, which ones had 503B9 exposure, which ones didn't mention it. And I'll just note here, this is a table that our system has created on its own. This table doesn't exist in any of the pleadings that it's looking at, right? This is gathering that information from across those 9 cases, across those 77 documents. And it's smart enough to recognize, this information should be presented in a tabular form to make it easier to access. But you can see sort of it goes through interim caps versus final caps. What was the structure? Again, creating its own tabular output, significance of committee oversight, and so on and so forth as it goes through all of the details of those documents. And again, this information will depend upon the documents that the user selected in terms of what's presented, but we're really looking at, how do you understand that collection of documents together? And then at the end, I just want to note that all of our outputs include an appendix that identifies the documents that were assigned in generating that output. And what's really, I think, important here is that means that this AI dossier functions as a standalone document in the sense that if someone goes back to this document at some future point in time, they're able to say within the document itself, what were the inputs to this document to understand the context of the output?
Mhm.
And I think when you think about this as think about the story behind this. What we tried to produce and what I think this document produces is you are an associate, you are new to a case, you are a firm new to a case, you are you're on a team that's involved in a case, and you get to this point where you receive the direction that we need to understand um, we need to understand relief from 5 different airlines. That's a lot of times that's the only direction that a professional will receive, that an associate would receive. Understand this. We need to understand the key terms. No one, they're not going to go through and say, here's the 20 fields and the 20 points of comparison between these 5 cases that I want to look at. Really, the question is, I just need to understand the similarities and the differences between these types of cases. What do we need to make sure that we include? That's oftentimes all the direction that a professional will receive, that an associate will receive. And so that's what we've captured here is let's look across, and like it said, 900 pages in 9 different cases, and let's identify all the points that might be relevant. And this is not, Randy mentioned this is not a template. This isn't the vendor relief summary template. We built a system that can look at all those documents and say, these are the tables we think would be relevant. These are the sections we think would be relevant based on the documents that were identified for this very specific search. That's the way professionals think. That's the way lawyers are asked to produce work. It's what's relevant with the precedent that I'm studying. So it's important to know that you will never see this again. You'll never see this presentation exactly in this form.
Mhm.
Again, if you choose different documents, you select more documents, less documents, different filters, or just the underlying substance in the document is different, your next search is not going to look exactly like this. It's not going to have every single one of these bullet points.
Does the dossier represent work that would have otherwise been done manually, or does it actually take it beyond what would have been done manually,
Well, so
or
uh,
neither, or neither of the above?
I think the answer is yes and no, in the sense of yes, it represents work that would have otherwise been done. So part of what you do in representing a party in bankruptcy is part of that identification of what is our strategy going to be, whether we're representing the debtor, whether we're representing the creditors committee, is identifying in similar cases what happened, right? And so there are things which are more universal across cases. You're always going to seek employee relief, right? Like all companies have employees. They have relatively similar benefit packages, right? Like you may have unique aspects if you have unionized employees, et cetera. But there's kind of always going to be a first day employee motion. But in an airline case, you also have very unique things like getting the fuel at airports. Like there are specific things around fueling aircraft at airports in the way that it works that results in a very industry specific motion, right? And so part of that process is always identifying what are the things that are common for this industry or common for cases like this. What, let's look at the judge that we're likely to be assigned or that we have already been assigned, and how does he rule or she rule on particular issues. So that process has always happened. But I think what we're really doing here that is unique is we're saying you don't have to be as narrow in terms of the amount of information that you can process, right? And our hope with sort of how this functions in practice is where an associate might have said, you know, I have 2 hours to look at this issue. How much can I look at in that 2 hours? We've really functionally changed the amount of information that can be processed in that 2 hour window or in that 8 hour window or whatever it is. So that associate can look at more information in the same amount of time to identify better, more comprehensive information, but also where you're looking for that needle in the haystack sort of question, we can really let you pull in a lot of information to be able to identify, I have this very specific provision that I'm looking for in an asset sale motion. Let me look at the last 100 asset sales to find out which ones had this particular provision. And we can really, again, with that sort of multi-level summarization, we can allow the user to really, dig into that and narrow down into it if they want to look at it, not just, maybe starting with the comparative analysis and then looking at individual cases, particularly if they've collected a group of documents for those cases. But we really think this is going to functionally let people do the same research, but in a more comprehensive and also a little bit different way.
Okay.
And I'll just note the other thing that we've already seen users do with this is we sort of talked about the cross case nature of it, but the other thing we've seen users do is they'll say, I'm getting involved in this case and using the Saks example, right? Saks has been in bankruptcy for 3 or 4 months, but there's already 2,500 documents that have been filed. So if I get retained today to represent a party in Saks, how do I get up to speed on that case? How do I understand what's happened? What are the key events in that case? And this is something where we've seen users say, what I really want to do is I'm going to create an AI dossier of the 30 most relevant pleadings or 40 most relevant pleadings in the case, so that I can create essentially a briefing book for myself
Hmm.
to read through, and all of a sudden, in 30 minutes, I've really got a good feel for what's happened, and my ability to then again either go back to my client and say, here's what's happened in the case so far, here's the status of the case, or let me start digging into where my client's interests are affected.
Yeah, that makes sense. Good. All right. I know we're running a little bit tight on time here. Is there anything else that you wanted to demonstrate here as part of this?
I
Uh,
think we've really hit the high points. So I am good. Robert, do you feel like there's anything else that you wanted to emphasize?
Like I said, we're storytellers, and so all we needed was a short prompt to really get us into the meat of what we're doing, and those were the highlights. Is searching the dossier. But like Randy said, there's so many different ways that professionals are using already that dossier. And so what we really wanted to show was the power of what it does in one example, but there's so many other applications of the same process because like I said, it's not a template. It's not one output. The output really depends on what you're asking and what documents you select and feed into the process.
so if somebody wants to learn more about those other applications and other examples and other stories, how do they go about doing that?
Sure.
That is a great question. Go ahead, Randy.
I was going to say, we have the ability now at researchsuite.stretto.com to learn more, but also to create an account where a user can, within 5 minutes, be in and be running searches and experimenting with the system to consider it in their own practice, maybe a question that they've researched recently, and see how that would go through our system.
So on a
And
trial
then
basis, they can do that. You mean is it on a trial basis
that's
rather
right.
than having a
Yeah,
license?
and then we're also always happy to talk through details of how it works.
Randy, I want to address this. The one, the trial account you said, that is an essential account. There's a completely a la carte account with no monthly user fees. So if anyone just wants to try it once, you sign up for an essential account. You have all the search functionality that exists, and then you can just purchase one dossier. You can purchase 10 documents. You can see one AI summary. If you just want to get one disclosure statement and get one quick summary of that one disclosure statement to try it, you can do that, like Randy said, within 5 minutes. Then the pricing changes, and as you sign up users, you sign up for a higher tier that has lower pricing on the transactional basis. But yeah, someone can have an AI dossier in your hands in 5 to 10 minutes after listening.
All right. Well, anything else in closing that you wanted to mention before we wrap up here?
Maybe where Randy was going to go was we are learning about these other uses. We were building the functionality with very specific use cases in mind. And as people have other ideas that, hey, you said something and a light bulb went off with the way that I do my research behind the scenes. I want to build an AI dossier. I want to build a dossier. I want to solve this problem that I run into oftentimes. Just the support email that's on the website goes directly to me and Randy. And if you can't figure out how to solve a solution for something that you think should be there based on what you're seeing, what the filters you're seeing, what the functionality you're seeing, Randy will help you do it. And then it helps us because we realize, hey, that's a problem that multiple people are trying to solve. Let's make it a little bit more clear how to get to that solution. We're also working on a almost like a case study library so people can see different examples once they log into the platform of different types of AI summaries and dossiers that we've created to really help people unlock and understand the power of this platform. Because this is not like a traditional search. And so as you have ideas or problems that you can't solve, let us know. And then as we find solutions for new problems, we want to put those out onto the platform so people can see new ways to use it.
Yeah. No, I was just going to, I mean, sort of on the same vein. I think we are, both Robert and I individually, but also Stretto as a company, we're really passionate about figuring out how we adopt this technology to solve the workflows of this specific practice area. And so, as people are thinking about this, we're always happy to have those conversations and understand, the unique aspects of different people's practices and how we can support those. Always happy to have those conversations. And again, as Robert said, that really provides us insight into how we continue developing the functionality of this platform on top of that data set that we've developed.
Well, it looks really good. I was really impressed, and it's I it just Randy, when you kind of started out talking about just some of the numbers of docket entries in some of these cases, that was intimidating enough. And I can see how this addresses that problem, but also goes so far beyond that issue. So thanks so much.
And
Been a
he didn't
pleasure
even
to
mention,
talk to you today. What'd you say, Rob?
sorry to cut you off. I was going to say, he didn't even mention Lehman Brothers with 63,000 docket entries. I mean, we were keeping it reasonable with Saks and the 2,500 or so that we're seeing now, but
Yeah,
we
I,
love that
I
63,000 number. We
I've been
talk about
practicing so
complexity.
law so long. The last time I touched a Chapter 11 case, I think was before PACER, possibly. So I never had those issues back in my younger days.
There you go.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your time, and we'll post on our description of the site all the URLs for everybody to go and find out more information and get in touch with you guys. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob. That was a great conversation.